February 1, 1943. Above the Tunisian desert, 20,000 feet. The pencil scraped across the navigation chart as Lieutenant Harry C. Newsell traced their return heading from Tunis, the figure smearing slightly through condensation on his oxygen mask. In 17 minutes, they would be outside the reach of German fighters. 17 minutes until comparative safety. Fighters, 12 o'clock high, closing fast. The intercom hissed with the tail gunner's alert, but Newsell scarcely had time to glance up before he heard it. A noise that would linger with him for the rest of his life. Not an explosion, not the familiar clatter of machine gun fire, but what he would later describe in a letter home as a clearly audible whoosh, followed by a violent jolt and a heavy thump through the plexiglass nosecone of Boeing B-17F All-American 3. Newsell stared in stunned disbelief as fragments of a German Messerschmitt Bf 109 spun past, part of a wing here, twisted fuselage sections there. The canopy, its iron cross plainly visible, corkscrewed toward the desert 5 miles below. The fighter had not detonated. It had not been shot down in the traditional sense. It had physically rammed their bomber, and somehow, impossibly, they were still airborne. What Lieutenant Harry Newsell did not know, what none of the 10 crewmen could have known at that moment, was that they had just become participants in one of the most thoroughly documented and analyzed incidents in aviation history. Their B-17 was flying with its tail section almost torn away, attached to the fuselage by only a handful of metal spars and thin strips of aluminum skin. The photograph taken of their aircraft within the next hour would become one of World War II's most iconic images, studied by engineers and pilots for decades. The mathematics of their survival contradicted every known rule of aerodynamics. Physics dictated they should already have been dead, tumbling in pieces toward the Sahara. Yet First Lieutenant Kendrick Robertson Bragg Jr., gripping the control yoke with the resolve of a former Duke University halfback who had never lost a game during his legendary 1938 season, was somehow keeping 65,000 pounds of crippled aluminum aloft. This instant would ignite one of the most improbable survival stories in the history of aerial combat, a testament to American engineering and human resolve that would force the German Luftwaffe to radically reassess its judgment of the B-17 Flying Fortress. The engines had rumbled to life in the pre-dawn darkness of Biskra Airfield, Algeria, their right cyclone radials sending vibrations through desert sand that had seeped into every crevice of the base. February 1 dawned with unusual clarity. No sandstorms, light winds, unlimited visibility, ideal bombing weather. As the operations officer had remarked during the 0400 briefing, First Lieutenant Kendrick Robertson Sonny Bragg Jr. ran his hands along the control surfaces of All-American 3 during his pre-flight inspection. At 25, Bragg carried himself with the quiet assurance of a man proven in multiple arenas. Newspapers back home in Savannah still praised his exploits with Duke's 1938 Iron Dukes undefeated, unscored upon in the regular season, a team no one could break. That mental toughness, that refusal to concede defeat even when the odds appeared overwhelming, had served him well since trading football cleats for flight boots. The Boeing B-17F-5BO, serial number 4124406, had been Bragg's aircraft since August 24, 1942. He knew every rivet, every peculiarity, every sound she made. Built at Boeing's Seattle plant, she had crossed the Atlantic as part of Operation Bolero, the massive aerial reinforcement of the European theater. The ground crew had painted her name in bold letters on the nose, All-American 3, the third aircraft to carry that hopeful title. Her predecessors had fallen to the hazards of war. "She's running smooth as silk," Technical Sergeant Joe C. James reported from the flight engineers panel. James, who would also man the top turret once they entered enemy airspace, possessed the mechanical instinct that separated competent engineers from exceptional ones. If James said the ship was ready, she was ready. The crew gathering that morning embodied the peculiar democracy of the American war effort, men from vastly different backgrounds, united by training and purpose. The co-pilot, Second Lieutenant Godfrey Engel Jr., hailed from a Connecticut banking family. The navigator, Harry C. Newsell, had left engineering studies at the University of Minnesota to join the Army Air Forces. The bombardier, Ralph Burbridge, had earned his wings before Pearl Harbor, making him among the most experienced men aboard despite being only 23. The enlisted crew contributed their own expertise. Radio operator Staff Sergeant Paul A. Galloway had mastered the temperamental radios linking bomber formations. Waist Gunners Staff Sergeant Michael Zuck and Sergeant Elton Condor, the latter a last-minute replacement from the 341st Squadron for a sick crewman, checked and rechecked their .50 caliber Brownings. And in the tail, Staff Sergeant Sam T. Serapulous, soon to earn the nickname Lonesome Sam for reasons that would become grimly apparent, settled into his isolated station with the stoicism of a man who understood he was the bomber's most exposed defender. The 97th Bombardment Group had been the first American heavy bomber unit to see combat in Europe, flying its initial mission from England on August 17, 1942. Since then, it had relocated to North Africa as part of Operation Torch, supporting the ground campaign to expel Axis forces from the continent. The group had already paid dearly aircraft and crews lost to fighters, flak, and the unforgiving arithmetic of strategic bombing. Today's target was a critical hub in the German supply network, the port facilities at Tunis and Bizerta. Every ton of supplies unloaded their prolonged Axis resistance in North Africa. Every successful bombing run pushed the Allies closer to clearing the continent and opening the gateway to southern Europe. The formation assembled over the Mediterranean with the rehearsed precision of an aerial ballet. 12 B17s of the 414th Bombardment Squadron formed into their defensive box pattern, a three-dimensional formation designed to maximize overlapping fields of fire from their .50 caliber machine guns. All-American 3 took her station on the right wing of the lead aircraft, Flaming, commanded by Major Robert Coulter, the squadron operations officer. The lack of fighter escort loomed over the formation like a dark cloud. The P-38 Lightnings that should have been weaving protective arcs around them were grounded by mechanical trouble. The B-17s would have to depend on their own guns and the unproven theory of mutual defense against determined fighter attack. At 20,000 feet, the temperature plunged to -40 degrees Fahrenheit. Ice crusted the windows, and the crew's breath froze inside their oxygen masks, requiring constant clearing to prevent blocked airflow. Electrically heated flight suits, a marvel of American engineering, struggled against the Arctic conditions at altitude. Men often returned from missions with frostbite rivaling their combat injuries. Target in sight, Bombardier Ralph Burbridge announced over the intercom as Tunis emerged through scattered clouds below. The port bristled with activity, ships unloading cargo, trains waiting on sidings, trucks streaming toward the front, where the Afrika Korps was making its final stand against Montgomery's 8th Army and Patton's 2 Corps. The bomb run demanded absolute precision. For 3 minutes, the aircraft had to fly straight and level, no evasive maneuvers, as Burbridge synchronized his Norden bombsight with the target beneath them. The secret device, so closely guarded that it was removed after every mission, used an intricate system of gyroscopes and mechanical calculations to determine the exact release point for the bomb's flak coming up, someone reported. Unnecessarily. Everyone could see the black puffs blossoming around them, each one representing hundreds of pieces of shrapnel seeking aluminum and flesh. The German 88mm anti-aircraft guns, originally designed as anti-tank weapons, had proven devastatingly effective against bombers. Each shell was fused to explode at a predetermined altitude, creating a box of death that bombers had to fly through. Bombs away, Burbridge announced. And All-American 3 lurched upward as 4,000 lb of high explosives fell from her bomb bay. Below the port erupted in smoke and flame, direct hits on the warehouses, secondary explosions from stored ammunition, ships listing at their moorings. A good strike, maybe their best yet. But the celebration was short-lived. As the formation turned west toward home, the fighters appeared. Bandits 2 o'clock high looks like 109s. The warning came from multiple gunners simultaneously as 2 Mesosmet Bf-109 G4 fighters dove from their perch in the sun. The German pilots had learned from hard experience that the B-7's defensive fire was weakest from the front. The nose guns couldn't depress enough to hit fighters coming in low, and the top turret couldn't traverse fast enough to track a high-speed frontal approach. The first fighter, piloted by Eloy Julius Meinberg of 11/JG2, temporarily attached to Yagashita 53. Picass, ace of spades, opened fire at 500 yards. His 20mm cannons and 13mm machine guns sparkled along his wings as he pumped rounds into Flaming. The lead bomber shuddered under the impact, pieces of aluminum peeling away like confetti. The second fighter flown by Feldwebel Erich Patzia of 6/JG-53 bore in on All-American 3. Patzia was novice. With 16 confirmed victories, he had earned the Ehrenpokal der Luftwaffe, the honor goblet awarded to successful fighter pilots. He knew exactly where to aim. The cockpit to kill the pilots, the engines to the bomber, the wing routes where the fuel tanks lived. But something went wrong. At 300 yards, Patzia began his escape maneuver, a half roll. That would take him under the bomber and out of the defensive fire. It was a move he had executed dozens of times, but this time, whether from overconfidence, target fixation, or a mechanical failure, he started the maneuver too late. Or perhaps, and here the historical record becomes crucial, he didn't start it at all because he was already dead. I had him in my sights, Ralph Burbridge would later recall. He was coming straight at us, and I could see his face through the windscreen. Then the top turret opened up. James had him too. The fighter jerked like someone had yanked it with a string and started this lazy roll to the right. Technical Sergeant Joe James, Manning. The twin 50 calibers in the top turret had put a burst directly into the Bf-109's cockpit. At least one round, possibly more, had found Erich Patzia. Whether he died instantly or was merely incapacitated, the effect was the same. 2,000 pounds of fighter aircraft traveling at over 350 miles per hour was suddenly without conscious control. What happened next occurred in less than 2 seconds, but would be analyzed for decades. The Bf-109 in its uncontrolled roll sliced into all American 3 just after of the waist gun positions. The German fighters' left wing cut through the bomber's fuselage like a sword through paper, creating a diagonal gash that ran from the base of the vertical stabilizer across to the left horizontal stabilizer, which was completely severed. Navigator Harry Knowles' contemporary account written to his brother within days of the incident provides the most visceral description. The fighter hit us with a swoosh and a bang that shook the whole ship. I looked back through the companionway and couldn't believe what I saw. Daylight where there should have been airplane. The physics of the impact defied comprehension. The Bf-109's wing, traveling at a relative velocity of nearly 400 miles per hour, should have cut the B-7 completely in half. Instead, by mere chance, or what many crew members would later call divine intervention, the fighter's wing missed the main structural spars on the right side of the fuselage by inches. The tail section containing Staff Sergeant Sam Sorilis remained attached by what investigators would later describe as the absolute minimum structural connection necessary to maintain any control authority. The German fighter disintegrated. Its wing, torn off by the impact, remained partially embedded in the B-7's fuselage. The engine and forward fuselage tumbled away in a ball of flame. The tail section with its distinctive yellow nose and black crosses spun like a maple seed toward the desert below. Inside that burning wreckage was Feldwebel Erich Patzia, born May 7, 1918 in Germany, who would be posthumously awarded his Ehrenpallon March 1, 1943, never knowing that his death had created one of aviation's most remarkable survival stories. But the crew of All-American 3 had no time to contemplate the fate of their attacker. They had problems of their own, problems that by all laws of physics and aerodynamics should have been insurmountable. Pilot to crew, check in. Everybody okay? Bragg's voice over the intercom was steady, betraying none of the physical strain of wrestling with controls that had suddenly gone mushy and unresponsive. The control cables to the tail surfaces, the elevator and rudder that allowed the pilot to control the aircraft's pitch and direction, had been severed or severely damaged. The aircraft wanted to nose down to enter what pilots called a graveyard spiral. One by one, the crew checked in. Miraculously, no one had been injured in the collision itself. But when it came time for the tail gunner to report, the intercom remained silent. "Cyrillus, Sam. You okay back there?" Still nothing. The interphone line to the tail position had been cut, but then through the jagged hole in the fuselage, the waist gunners could see movement in the tail section. Sam Cyrillus was alive, trapped in a tail section that was moving independently from the rest of the aircraft, swaying with each air current like, as one crew member described it, a kite on a string. In a hurricane. The full extent of the damage was staggering. The left horizontal stabilizer was completely gone, shorn off by the Bf-109's wing. The elevator on that side had vanished with it. The vertical stabilizer, the large upright tail surface, had a massive gash through its base. The fuselage itself was open like a tin can from the tail gunners position forward to just behind the waist gun windows. Control cables hung loose in the slipstream. Hydraulic fluid leaked from severed lines. Lieutenant Charles Cliff Cutforth, navigator aboard the nearby B-17 flying Flit gun, managed to maneuver close enough to take a photograph that would become one of the war's most famous images. In it, the tail section of All-American 3 is clearly offset from the normal alignment, caned at an angle that suggests imminent structural failure. The diagonal slash through the fuselage is visible along with the missing stabilizer. The fact that the aircraft is maintaining level flight seems to violate fundamental laws of physics. Jesus Christ, someone breathed over the intercom. The whole back end is about to come off. Co-pilot Godfrey Engel Jr. worked frantically with Bragg to find some combination of control inputs that would keep them airborne. With the traditional control surfaces compromised, they had to innovate. The autopilot system connected to the Norden bombsight used electrical servos rather than mechanical cables. By engaging it partially, they could provide some stability. Differential engine power. Running the left engines at higher power. Then the right could help counteract the tendency to yaw, but every input had to be gentle, measured. Too much force on any control and the tail might simply tear away. All-American. Major Coulter's voice crackled over the radio from Flaming My, which had also been badly damaged in the fighter attack. "Can you make it home?" Bragg looked at the fuel gauges. No major fuel leaks. Tanks still reading. Adequate reserves. Engines all running. Temperatures and pressures normal. Electrical systems functioning. The only thing wrong with the aircraft was that it was missing a significant portion of its structure. A minor detail, really. "We're going to try," Bragg responded. In the nearly severed tail section, Staff Sergeant Sam T. Cyrillus faced a decision that would have paralyzed most men. He could stay where he was, hoping the tail would hold until landing, or he could attempt to crawl forward through the damaged fuselage to the relative safety of the main aircraft body. The tail section was moving independently, sometimes feet out of alignment with the rest of the aircraft. Each movement stressed the few remaining connections, any sudden maneuver, any strong turbulence, and he would be riding 5 tons of aluminum to his death. Cyrillus made his choice. Gathering his chest parachute, his equipment, and in a detail that would become legend, a borrowed jacket that belonged to Lieutenant Bragg, he began the most dangerous 30-foot he would ever travel. The scene inside the fuselage was apocalyptic. Daylight streamed through tears in the aluminum skin. Wind howled through the gaps, creating a maelstrom of loose equipment, spent shell casings, and debris from the German fighter. The fuselage floor, never designed to support weight without the surrounding structure, flexed dangerously under his hands and knees. One wrong move, one failure of the overstressed aluminum, and he would fall through into 5 miles of empty air. Waist gunner Michael Zook watched Cyrillus's approach with a combination of admiration and disbelief. He came crawling through that mess like it was a Sunday stroll, Zook would later recall. Calm as could be, dragging his gear behind him. When he finally made it to us, first thing he does is hand the lieutenant's jacket to me and say, "Make sure the skipper gets this back. He might need it when we land." The journey that should have taken seconds had taken nearly 10 minutes, but Sam Saras had made it. All 10 crew members were now in the forward section of the aircraft should they need to bail out. The bomber formation faced a terrible decision. Standard procedure dictated that damaged aircraft that couldn't keep pace should be left behind. They endangered the entire formation by forcing it to slow down and become more vulnerable to fighter attack. But the crews of the 414th Squadron weren't about to abandon All-American 3. The formation closed ranks around the wounded bomber, creating a defensive shield with their massed firepower. It meant accepting greater risk for themselves, flying slower, maintaining formation longer, staying in enemy airspace precious minutes more than necessary. But these were men who had trained together, lived together in the harsh conditions of North African bases, and lost friends together. The arithmetic of survival took second place to loyalty. All-American, this is Red Leader, the formation commander radioed. "We're staying with you until you're clear of fighter range. Keep her steady." The German fighters, seeing the tight defensive formation and perhaps low on fuel and ammunition, eventually turned away. They had claimed their victories, or so they thought. Julius Meinberg, Erich Paxia's wingman, would survive the day despite suffering severe burns when defensive fire ignited his oxygen system. In his post-war memoir, Fin Bourron, Contact with the Enemy, he would claim a B-17 kill from this engagement. He was half right. Flaming May would indeed go down. Major Coulter and 6 crew members killed, but All-American 3 refused to die. As the formation finally crossed into Allied-controlled airspace, the other bombers began to peel away, waggling their wings in salute as they headed for Biskra. All-American 3 flying at reduced speed to minimize stress on the damaged structure would make the journey alone. The flight from the target area to Biskra airfield should have taken an hour. For All-American 3 fighting to stay airborne, it would take 90 minutes that felt like 90 years. Every air pocket, every bit of turbulence sent shudders through the aircraft that made the crew hold their breath. The tail section continued its independent movement, sometimes aligned with the fuselage, sometimes caned at angles that defied belief. Bragg and Engel developed a rhythm, a delicate dance with the dying aircraft. Gentle pressure on the yoke, never sudden movements. Adjust the throttles incrementally. Feel the aircraft's response. Adjust again. They flew more by instinct than by instruments, sensing through their hands and feet what the aircraft could tolerate. Flight engineer Joe James monitored the engines obsessively. Number 3 was running slightly hot, possibly from debris damage, but still within acceptable limits. Oil pressure steady on all 4. Fuel consumption actually improved due to their reduced speed. The Wright Cyclone radials built in factories across America by workers who would never know how their precision saved lives continued their steady thunder. "Navigator, how far to base?" Bragg asked. Harry Newell had been continuously calculating and recalculating their position. The damage had affected the aircraft's trim, causing it to fly slightly sideways, what pilots called a crab. This affected both their speed and fuel consumption, but his calculations showed they would make it, albeit with minimal reserves. 40 minutes. Skipper weather's still clear at base. Radio operator Paul Galloway had been in constant contact with Biskra Tower, updating them on the aircraft's condition. The base had mobilized every available emergency vehicle. Ambulances, fire trucks, and crash crews lined the runway. The base commander himself had come to the tower to monitor the situation. The crew went through their landing preparation with mechanical precision, each man checking and rechecking their equipment. They kept their parachutes on. If the tail separated during landing, they might have seconds to evacuate. Waist gunners Zook and Condared loose equipment that could become projectiles in a crash. Bombardier Burbridge secured the bomb site, still following protocol even in extremists. Unknown to the crew of All American 3, their survival was already causing ripples through the German fighter community in North Africa. The pilots who had witnessed the collision were filing their reports, and the intelligence officers were struggling to explain what they had seen. The Luftwaffe had extensive experience with the B-7 Flying Fortress. They had been fighting them since the Americans entered the European Air War, and they thought they understood the bombers' capabilities and limitations. German technical analysis had determined that AB-7 required approximately 20 hits from 20mm cannon shells to ensure destruction. The aircraft's multiple redundant systems, self-sealing fuel tanks, and robust construction made it frustratingly difficult to bring down. But this, AB-17 flying with half its tail missing, was beyond their calculations. The initial reports were met with skepticism. Surely the pilots had been mistaken. Perhaps the bomber had crashed. Later, out of sight. No aircraft could survive such damage. Yet the evidence was incontrovertible. Multiple pilots had witnessed All American 3 flying in formation after the collision. Ground observers had tracked it on radar, maintaining altitude and heading long after it should have fallen from the sky. The incident would be added to a growing file of reports that forced the Luftwaffe to reconsider their tactical approach to attacking American heavy bombers. General Adolf Galland, one of Germany's most successful fighter aces and a key figure in Luftwaffe fighter tactics, would later write about the psychological impact of American bomber durability. To see a flying fortress continue flying with injuries that would have destroyed any other aircraft was deeply demoralizing to our young pilots. They would expend their ammunition, score what should have been killing hits, and watch the Americans fly home. Biskra Tower, this is All American, 5 minutes out. Request straight in approach runway 27. All American Biskra Tower, you're cleared for immediate approach, runway 27. Emergency vehicle standing by. How many wounded aboard? Bragg and Engel exchanged glances. By all rights, they should all be dead. Yet here they were, 10 men without a scratch among them. At least not from the collision. Tower, All American, no. Wounded, just need a straight approach. We've got structural damage. The understatement of the year. Through the windscreen, the brown expanse of Biskra Airfield materialized from the desert haze. Home. Safety. Solid ground. The most beautiful sight any of them had ever seen. Gear coming down. Engel announced, moving the lever. The landing gear was operated by a separate hydraulic system from the control surfaces, and to everyone's relief, they heard and felt the reassuring thunk of the wheels locking into position. 3 green lights on the panel. The gear was down and locked. Flaps? Engel asked. Bragg considered. Flaps would slow them down for landing, but would also change the airflow over the tail, potentially adding stress to the damaged structure. No flaps will come in hot and use the whole runway. The approach required every ounce of skill Bragg had developed in hundreds of hours of flight training. The aircraft didn't want to fly straight. It wanted to yaw, to roll, to pitch down. Every correction required an opposite correction. A constant battle against aerodynamic forces that should have won 80 miles ago. 1 mile out, half a mile. The runway rushed up to meet them, wider and more welcome than any runway had ever been. Ground crews lined the taxiways, watching in stunned silence as the impossible aircraft made its final approach. Some would later say they could see daylight through the fuselage from a 4 mile away. The main wheels kissed the sand-swept runway at 110 miles per hour, faster than normal, but as gently as Bragg could manage. The aircraft settled, and for a moment it seemed the landing would be textbook perfect. Then, physics reasserted itself. Without the tailwheel, which had been destroyed in the collision, the tail section dropped to the runway surface. The aircraft became a 65,000-pound sled grinding down the runway in a shower of sparks and aluminum fragments. The sound was indescribable. Metal on concrete, a shriek that could be heard miles away. Bragg and Engel stood on the brakes, fighting to keep the aircraft straight as it decelerated. Without the tail wheel and with compromised rudder control, any deviation from straight ahead could cause a ground loop, a violent rotation that would certainly tear the aircraft apart. 100 yards, 200, 300. The aircraft finally ground to a stop, sitting at an awkward angle with its tail on the runway and its nose pointed skyward. For a moment, nobody moved. Then, as if on signal, all 10 crew members scrambled for the exits. They assembled on the runway, looking back at their aircraft in disbelief. The damage was even worse than they had imagined. The tail section hung at an impossible angle, connected to the fuselage by what appeared to be strips of aluminum no thicker than heavy paper. How it had held together for 90 minutes of flight was beyond comprehension. "No business, Doc," Bragg told the flight surgeon, who rushed up with his medical team. "We're all fine. Not a scratch." The doctor looked from the crew to the aircraft and back again, his expression suggesting he was witnessing either a miracle or a mass hallucination. What happened next would become part of the legend, told and retold in ready rooms across the theater. 3 ground crew members from another squadron, curious about the damage, climbed aboard All-American 3 to get a closer look. They made their way off, peering through the gash in the fuselage, marveling at the destruction. Their combined weight, perhaps 500 pounds, was the final straw. With a grinding, tearing sound of overstressed metal finally giving way, the tail section separated completely from the fuselage and collapsed onto the runway. The 3 airmen scrambled clear, white-faced and shaking, suddenly understanding just how close to death the aircrew had been for the past 90 minutes. Master Sergeant Hank Highland, the crew chief responsible for All-American 3, walked slowly around the wreckage, taking notes on a clipboard. His job would be to determine if the aircraft could be repaired or should be written off as a total loss. It was a question that should have been academic. No aircraft this badly damaged could ever fly again. But this was 1943 and America was producing B-17 at a rate that seemed impossible to everyone except the Americans themselves. In Seattle, Burbank and Long Beach, workers were completing a new flying fortress every few hours. The production lines ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, staffed by men too old or too young for military service, and by women who had never seen the inside of a factory before Pearl Harbor. Highland looked at the serial number painted on the tail, 41 to 2446. This aircraft had already survived more than any machine should be asked to endure. Perhaps she had one more miracle left in her. The conventional wisdom said All-American 3 was finished. The damage was too extensive, the structural integrity too compromised. In any other Air Force, she would have been cannibalized for spare parts and the remainder scrapped. But the United States Army Air Forces in 1943 operated on a different philosophy. If it could be fixed, it would be fixed. Master Sergeant Highland and the men of the 50th Air Service Squadron spent 6 weeks performing what could only be described as major surgery. They found a tail section from another B-17 that had been damaged beyond repair in a landing accident. Using techniques more suited to a shipyard than an aircraft maintenance facility, they grafted the salvage tail onto All-American 3. The work was meticulous and exhausting. Every rivet had to be perfect. Every control cable had to be properly tensioned. Every electrical connection had to be tested and retested. The men worked in the desert heat that could reach 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Then through the desert nights when the temperature would plummet toward freezing. They worked because every repaired aircraft meant one more bomber to strike at the enemy, one step closer to ending the war. The repair was crude by Boeing factory standards. The aircraft would never be the same. She would be slower, less responsive, prone to vibrations that hadn't existed before. But on May 10, 1943, All-American 3 flew again, carrying another crew on a mission to Sicily. The ground crews watched her take off with a mixture of pride and apprehension. They had brought her back from the dead, but would she hold together? She did. All-American 3 would continue flying missions, though relegated to less demanding roles, transport flights, training missions, milk runs to areas where fighter opposition was unlikely. She had earned the right to an easier life. On March 6, 1945, at Lucera Airfield in Italy, she was finally retired and salvaged, her war over at last. The research into the identity of the German pilot who collided with All-American 3 reveals a young man whose story intersected with history in the most violent way possible. Feldwebel Erich Paxia was 24 years old on February 1, 1943. Just a year younger than Kendrick Bragg. Born on May 7, 1918, he had grown up in a Germany transformed by National Socialism. Trained in glider clubs that were secretly preparing pilots for the Luftwaffe that wasn't supposed to exist under the Treaty of Versailles. By early 1943, Paxia had proven himself an exceptional fighter pilot. His 16 confirmed victories placed him among the successful but not legendary aces of the Luftwaffe, men who did their job with skill and professionalism, but whose names wouldn't be celebrated in propaganda broadcasts. He flew with 6/Jagdgeschwader 53 Pikas, one of the most successful fighter wings in the Luftwaffe, credited with over 4,000 Allied aircraft destroyed during the war. The Bf-109 G4 he flew that day represented the latest evolution of Willy Messed's revolutionary fighter design. Powered by a Daimler-Benz DB605 engine producing 1,475 horsepower. Armed with a 20mm cannon firing through the propeller hub and two 13mm machine guns in the nose, it was a formidable opponent for any Allied aircraft. In the hands of an experienced pilot like Paxia, it should have been more than a match for a lumbering B-7. But the calculus of aerial combat is unforgiving. One moment of inattention, one bullet in the wrong place, and experience becomes irrelevant. The burst from Technical Sergeant Joe James's twin .50 calibers found its mark. And Erich Paxia's war ended in an instant. His body was recovered from the wreckage of his fighter and buried at Borj Sedria German War Cemetery in Ben Arouz, Tunisia, where it remains to this day. Plot 3, Row 8, Grave 15. On March 1, 1943, Paxia was posthumously awarded the Ehrung Pal die Luftwaffe, the honor goblet that recognized his achievements as a fighter pilot. The citation made no mention of the collision, only noting that he had died in aerial combat against enemy bombers. His family would receive the traditional letter from his commanding officer, expressing regret and praising his service to the Reich. They would never know that their son's death had created one of the most remarkable survival stories in aviation history. The survival of All-American 3 became a case study for Boeing engineers and Army Air Force's technical analysts. How had an aircraft missing critical structural components managed to fly for 90 minutes? The answer lay in the revolutionary design philosophy that had created the B-17. Unlike previous bombers which relied on a single main spar running through the wing and fuselage, the B-7 used a semi-mono construction. The strength came not from a single component but from the entire structure working together. The aluminum skin itself carried loads, reinforced by frames and stringers that distributed stress throughout the airframe. When primary load paths failed, secondary and even tertiary paths could, under the right circumstances, carry enough load to maintain structural integrity. The key to All-American 3's survival was what hadn't been damaged. The wing-to-fuselage junction, the strongest point on the aircraft, remained intact. The main wing spars carrying the weight of 4 engines and fuel tanks were undamaged. The bomb bay area with its robust construction necessary to carry 8,000 pounds of ordnance provided a rigid box that held the forward and aft sections together even when the connecting structure was compromised. Boeing engineer William Allen, reviewing the incident reports, noted that the B-7 had been designed with combat damage in mind from the beginning. "We knew these aircraft would take hits," he wrote in a technical memorandum. "We built in redundancy wherever possible. Multiple control cables, backup hydraulic systems, structural members that could carry loads even when their neighbors failed." The fact that this aircraft survived such extreme damage validates every extra pound of structure we included. The electrical system played a crucial role in the aircraft's survival. While the mechanical control cables were severed or damaged, the electrical wires running to the autopilot servos remained partially functional. This allowed Bragg and Engel to maintain some control authority through the Norden bombsit's autopilot system, a capability that hadn't been designed for this purpose, but proved invaluable in extremists. The survival of All-American 3 sent ripples through both Allied and Axis air forces. For American bomber crews, it became a morale-boosting legend told in briefing rooms from England to Italy. If All-American 3 could make it home with half her tail shot off, surely their damaged aircraft could make it, too. The psychological impact was immeasurable. Crews flew with greater confidence, knowing their flying fortresses could absorb punishment that would destroy other aircraft. The 414th Bombardment Squadron adopted a new emblem inspired by the incident: a puppy praying atop an aircraft's tail section, a reference to the phrase "coming in on a wing in a prayer." Though the famous song of that title was actually written about another aircraft, Thunderbird, the association with All-American 3 became permanent in squadron law. For the Germans, the incident reinforced growing concerns about American industrial capability. Field Marshal Gerhard Milch, responsible for Luftwaffe aircraft production, had already warned about the strategic implications of American bomber production. "The Americans are building bombers like we build cars," he told a conference of fighter commanders. "No, faster than we build cars. And these bombers are not fragile. They are flying tanks." The tactical implications were significant. Luftwaffe doctrine had assumed that catastrophic structural damage would destroy any bomber. Pilots were trained to aim for critical points, wing routes, cockpits, bomb bays, where a few well-placed cannon shells should prove fatal. But incidents like All-American 3 proved that even perfect shots might not bring down a B-17. Major G.A. Rall, who would become the third highest-scoring ace in history with 275 victories, wrote about the frustration of attacking B-17s. "You would attack, score hits, see pieces flying off, and watch the bomber continue flying. You would attack again, expend all your ammunition, and still it flew. Sometimes you wondered if American bombers were protected by supernatural forces. The Germans began developing new tactics, attacking from the front where defensive armament was weakest, concentrating multiple fighters on single bombers, and developing heavier weapons specifically for bomber destruction. The 30 million Malawian Quach's 108 cannon firing explosive shells that could blow meter-wide holes in bomber structures was a direct response to the B17's durability. The 10 men who survived the impossible flight of All-American 3 would carry the experience for the rest of their lives, each processing it in their own way. Their story, verified by contemporary documents and eyewitness accounts, stands as one of the most thoroughly documented incidents in World War II aviation history. First, Lieutenant Kendrick Robertson Bragg Jr. would complete his tour of duty and return to the United States, where he served as an instructor pilot, teaching new bomber crews the skills that might one day save their lives. He rarely spoke about February 1, 1943, even to his family. When pressed, he would simply say, "We were lucky. Good airplane, good crew, lucky." He died on October 13, 1999 at the age of 81, taking with him the full measure of what it felt like to fly an aircraft that shouldn't have been flyable. Navigator Harry C. Newsell's letter home, written within days of the incident, provides our most contemporary account of the event. The letter, preserved with all 10 crew members' signatures, captures the immediate aftermath before time and retelling could alter the details. "I still can't believe we made it," he wrote. "When I looked back and saw daylight through the airplane, I thought we were finished. But Bragg and Engel kept her flying. I don't know how, but they did." Nestle would pass away on June 27, 1991 at age 74. Bombardier Ralph Burbridge became the crew's unofficial historian, spending decades correcting the myths that accumulated around their story. In interviews conducted near the end of his life, he systematically debunked the embellishments. No, they hadn't used parachute cords to hold the plane together. No, they hadn't completed their bomb run after the collision. It happened on the way home. No, they weren't headed for England, but back to their base in Algeria. Burbridge understood that the true story was remarkable enough without exaggeration. He died on February 3, 2013 at age 92, one of the last surviving witnesses to that day over Tunisia. Co-pilot Godfrey Engel Jr. returned to Connecticut after the war, rarely speaking of his military service. Those who knew him said he would sometimes unconsciously move his hands as if working aircraft controls, especially during thunderstorms. He lived until May 3, 2007, dying at age 92 with his family around him. Technical Sergeant Jock, whose guns had killed Eric Patzia and precipitated the collision, struggled with the complexity of his role in the event. He had saved his crew by shooting down an attacking fighter, but that action had led to a collision that nearly killed them all. The paradox haunted him. "I did my job," he would say when asked. "That's all any of us did, our job." The waist gunners, Michael Zuck and Elton Condor, maintained that watching Sam Sorilis crawl through the destroyed fuselage was the bravest thing they witnessed in the war. "We saw a lot of brave men do brave things," Zuck said in a 1985 interview. "But Sam crawling through that mess, calm as could be, that was something special." Staff Sergeant Sam T. Sarpulis himself, Lonesome Sam, who had ridden the severed tail section, became something of a legend in the Army Air Forces. His matter-of-fact courage, exemplified by his concern for returning Bragg's jacket, represented the kind of unflappable determination that characterized the best of American aircrew. "What else was I going to do?" he said when asked about his crawl through the damaged fuselage. "Sit there and wait to fall out of the sky. Better to die trying than die waiting." Radio operator Paul Galloway would note that maintaining communication with the base during the return flight was one of the hardest things he ever did. Every time the plane lurched, I thought we were coming apart, but I kept transmitting our position, keeping my voice steady. If we went down, I wanted them to know where to find us. The photograph taken by Lieutenant Charles Cliff Cutforth from Flying Flit Gun became one of World War II's most analyzed images, catalogued as U.S. Air Force Photo 050524F1234. P015. It shows all American 3 in profile against the North African desert. The damage to her tail section clearly visible. The image would be studied by engineers, pilots, and historians for decades, each searching for clues to explain the impossible. What the photograph reveals is both devastating damage and improbable survival. The left horizontal stabilizer is completely gone. The vertical stabilizer shows a massive diagonal gash. The fuselage is opened from the tail gunner's position forward. Yet the aircraft maintains level flight. All 4 engines running. No sign of the imminent structural failure that physics demands should be occurring. The photograph has been frequently misattributed and misidentified over the years. It has been claimed to show the aircraft over the English Channel escorted by P-51 Mustangs. It has been published with captions claiming it was taken from a German fighter. Some versions have been docked to make the damage appear even more dramatic than it was. But the original authenticated photograph needs no embellishment. It captures a moment that shouldn't exist. An aircraft flying despite damage that exceeds all design tolerances, all safety margins, all reasonable expectations. It is visual proof of what 10 men achieved through skill, determination, and what many would call divine intervention. The incident of February 1, 1943 occurred at a crucial juncture in the North African campaign. The Afrika Korps, once seemingly invincible under Erwin Rommel, was being squeezed between Montgomery's 8th Army advancing from the east and American forces pushing from the west. The port facilities at Tunis and Bizerta, the targets of that day's mission, were vital lifelines for Axis forces. Every successful bombing mission hastened the inevitable German surrender in North Africa. Within 3 months of all American 3's miraculous return, Axis forces in North Africa would capitulate. On May 13, 1943, nearly 250,000 German and Italian soldiers surrendered in Tunisia, a defeat comparable to Stalingrad in its impact on German military capability. The bombers of the 97th Bombardment Group, including the repaired All-American 3, had played their part in this victory. The B-17 Flying Fortress would go on to become the most iconic American bomber of World War II. Though the B-24 Liberator was produced in greater numbers and could carry a heavier bomb load farther, it was the B-7 that captured the public imagination. Its ability to absorb punishment and bring its crews home became legendary. By war's end, B-17s had dropped 640-36 tons of bombs on European targets, more than any other American aircraft. But the cost was staggering. Of the 12,731 B-7s produced, 4,735 were lost in combat. Each loss represented 10 young men who wouldn't come home. The survival rate for bomber crews was among the lowest in the military. Completion of a 25 mission tour, later raised to 35, was considered beating the odds. The miracle of All-American 3 stood in stark contrast to the brutal arithmetic of strategic bombing. Aviation engineers studying the All-American 3 incident have provided valuable insights into how the aircraft managed to survive. Analysis suggests that the aircraft was operating at the absolute margins of controllability. The center of gravity had shifted dramatically aft due to the lost structure, putting the aircraft into a condition that would challenge even modern flight control systems. The key factors in the survival were structural. Redundancy. The B-17's design included multiple load paths for critical forces. When primary structures failed, secondary systems, never intended to carry full loads, managed to hold just enough to maintain basic integrity. Speed reduction. By immediately reducing airspeed, Bragg minimized the aerodynamic forces trying to tear the aircraft apart. Every mile perf of speed reduction decreased the stress on the damaged structure exponentially. Gentle control inputs analysis shows that any aggressive control input would have exceeded the remaining structure's capability. Bragg and Engel's gentle, coordinated control movements kept forces within survivable limits. Weight distribution. The cruise movement forward from the tail section actually helped by shifting the center of gravity forward, partially compensating for the lost tail weight. Environmental factors. The relatively smooth air over the North African desert meant no severe turbulence to stress the damaged structure. Had they encountered a thunderstorm or severe turbulence, the aircraft would not have survived. The engineering community continues to study this incident as an example of how robust design and skilled piloting can combine to achieve seemingly impossible outcomes. The lessons learned from all American III influenced post-war aircraft design, particularly in areas of structural redundancy and battle damage tolerance. Research into Luftwaffe archives provides the German perspective on the incident. The loss of Erich Patzia was recorded in the war diary of JG-53 with typical German precision. Patzia failed to return from combat mission against American bomber formation. Witnessed colliding with enemy aircraft by Oberleutnant Meinberg. Aircraft and pilot lost. What the official records don't capture is the impact such incidents had on German fighter morale. Young pilots, many with less than 100 hours of flight time by 1943, were told that American bombers were easy targets, slow and vulnerable. Then they would attack these easy targets and watch them absorb incredible damage and keep flying. Oberstleutnant Egon Meer, who developed the head-on attack tactic that would become standard Luftwaffe doctrine against bomber formations, wrote, "The American bombers were not what we expected. We expected them to be like our own bombers, fragile, requiring fighter escort, vulnerable to determined attack. Instead, we found flying fortresses in the true sense. Castles in the air that could defend themselves and survive damage that seemed impossible." The Luftwaffe began keeping detailed records of B-7 survivability, trying to determine weak points and optimal attack angles. Their studies showed that even when they achieved what should be catastrophic damage, B-7s had a disturbing tendency to make it home. This led to the development of increasingly heavy armament for fighter aircraft, culminating in rockets and 30mm cannons specifically designed for bomber destruction. At the Boeing plant in Seattle, news of all-American III survival was met with quiet satisfaction. The engineers and workers who had designed and built aircraft 41 to 24,406 had never met the men who flew her, but they felt a connection nonetheless. Every rivet driven, every wire connected, every system tested had contributed to bringing those 10 men home. The B-7 design had begun in 1934, when the U.S. Army Air Corps issued a requirement for a multi-engine bomber. Boeing's Model 299, which would become the B-17, first flew on July 28, 1935. From the beginning, the design philosophy emphasized survivability, multiple engines so the aircraft could fly with one or two failed, redundant control systems, self-sealing fuel tanks, armor plating around critical components and crew positions. But the incident of all-American III exceeded even Boeing's expectations. The company would use the incident in training materials for new engineers, demonstrating the importance of redundancy and over-engineering. Build it stronger than it needs to became an unofficial motto because someday someone's life will depend on that extra strength. The production statistics of the B-7 program remain staggering even by today's standards. At peak production, Boeing, Douglas, and Lockheed Vega were completing 16 B-7s every day. The workforce included thousands of women, Rosie the Riveters, who had never worked in manufacturing before the war. Yet, they achieved quality standards that would be challenging today with computer-controlled machinery. Over the decades, the story of All-American 3 has accumulated layers of myth and exaggeration. Various retellings have added dramatic elements that never occurred. The crew using parachute cords to hold the plane together, completing their bombing run after the collision, flying all the way to England, the tail gunner being rescued mid-flight. These embellishments, while dramatic, actually diminish the true achievement. The reality, verified by contemporary documents, crew testimony, and photographic evidence, needs no exaggeration. 10 men flew a catastrophically damaged aircraft 90 minutes and 150 miles to safety. They did it through skill, determination, and teamwork. They did it without losing a single crew member. They did it in an aircraft that had no business flying, but somehow forgot to fall from the sky. Ralph Burbridge, the bombardier who spent his later years correcting the record, understood this. The true story is amazing enough, he said in his final interview. We don't need to make things up. What happened that day was impossible, but we did it anyway. That's the story that should be told. The 414th Bombardment Squadron would fly 178 combat missions during World War II, losing 85 aircraft and hundreds of air crew. But no story from their combat record matched All-American 3 for sheer impossibility. The incident became part of squadron identity. A touchstone story that defined what they were capable of achieving. The squadron's new emblem, inspired by the incident, showed a puppy praying atop a tail section. The choice of a puppy rather than a more martial symbol reflected the youth of the air crew. Most were in their early 20s and their vulnerability in the face of enemy fighters and flak. Yet the praying attitude suggested both hope and the divine intervention many crew members genuinely believed had saved all. American 3 veterans of the 414th would gather for reunions decades after the war, and inevitably someone would retell the story of February 1, 1943. Men who had flown their own harrowing missions, who had their own stories of survival against the odds, would listen with respect to the tale of the bomber that refused to die. The German fighter forces encounter with All-American 3 was part of a learning curve that would drive significant tactical and technical evolution throughout 1943. The Luftwaffe had begun the war with fighters optimized for dogfighting, light maneuverable aircraft with rifle-caliber machine guns adequate for downing other fighters. The appearance of heavy bombers forced a complete reconsideration. By mid-1943, partially in response to incidents like All-American 3, German fighters were being upgunned with heavier weapons. The Bf-109 G6, introduced shortly after the Tunisia incident, carried a 30 million Malawian Quachas 108 cannon that fired explosive shells capable of blowing meter-wide holes in bomber structures. The FW-190 was modified to carry multiple 20mm cannons and even 210mm rockets, specifically for bomber destruction. Major Walter Known, who would become one of the Luftwaffe's most successful bomber interceptors with 258 victories, wrote about the evolution. Each month, the American bombers seemed to get tougher. We would develop new tactics, new weapons, and they would counter with better defensive formations, better armor, longer-range escort fighters. It was a race we were slowly losing. The psychological impact on German pilots was significant. Young pilots, increasingly poorly trained as the war progressed, were told to press home attacks against bomber formations. But pressing home attacks against B-7s meant flying into converging streams of 0.50 caliber fire from multiple aircraft. The survival rate for German fighter pilots declined precipitously as 1943 progressed. The survival of all American 3 was made possible not just by Boeing's design but by an entire industrial ecosystem that supported the aircraft. The Wright R-1820 Cyclone engines were built in factories in New Jersey and Ohio. The .50 caliber machine guns came from facilities in Connecticut and Michigan. The aluminum skin was rolled in plants in Tennessee and Washington. The instruments were manufactured in dozens of specialized facilities across the country. This distributed production network meant that no single bombing raid, no single sabotage operation could significantly impact B-17 production. It also meant that improvements and modifications could be rapidly implemented across the production network. Lessons learned from combat damage were incorporated into new aircraft within weeks. The scale of American industrial mobilization remains difficult to comprehend. In 1939, the U.S. Army Air Corps had 1,700 aircraft total. By 1945, American factories had produced nearly 300,000 military aircraft. The B-7 program alone employed over 40,000 workers at Boeing's Seattle plant, working 3 shifts around the clock. Beyond the technical marvel and strategic implications, the story of All-American 3 is fundamentally about 10 young men facing impossible circumstances. They were not professional soldiers, but citizens who had answered their nation's call. Bragg had been a college athlete, NES, an engineering student. Burbridge had joined before Pearl Harbor simply because he wanted to fly. Their calm professionalism in the face of catastrophic damage speaks to the quality of American aircrew training. The Army Air Forces had created from scratch the largest aerial training program in history. By 1943, training bases scattered across America were producing 100,000 new pilots annually, along with similar numbers of navigators, bombarders, gunners, and other aircrew. This training emphasized not just technical skills, but crew coordination and emergency procedures. Crews flew together through advanced training, learning each other's strengths and weaknesses, developing the teamwork that would save lives in combat. The crew of All-American 3 had flown together for months, creating the mutual trust that allowed them to function effectively even when their aircraft was literally falling apart around them. While the survival of one bomber might seem tactically insignificant in a war involving thousands of aircraft, the strategic impact was considerable. The incident occurred during a critical period when American daylight bombing doctrine was being severely tested. The theory that heavily armed bombers could fight their way to targets without fighter escort was proving costly. But incidents like All-American 3 provided evidence that the B-7 could at least survive the journey home even when severely damaged. This survivability meant that experienced crews were more likely to complete their tours, preserving institutional knowledge and improving overall effectiveness. It meant that damaged aircraft could be repaired and returned to service rather than being total losses. More importantly, it affected German strategic calculations. If American bombers were this difficult to destroy, and if American industry could produce them faster than Germany could shoot them down, then the mathematics of aerial attrition favored the Allies. This realization contributed to the gradual shift of German production priorities from offensive to defensive weapons, from bombers to fighters. A shift that would ultimately prove futile despite extensive records. Some aspects of All-American 3's survival continue to be studied by engineers. How did the few remaining structural members, designed to carry perhaps 20% of the loads they endured, hold together for 90 minutes? Why didn't aerodynamic flutter, the destructive oscillation that can tear damaged aircraft apart, develop during the return flight? The airplane appeared to be operating in what engineers call a nonlinear regime, a condition where conventional aerodynamic rules become unpredictable. The fact that it remained controllable in this state may have been due to a fortunate combination of circumstances, the particular damage pattern, atmospheric conditions, and the skill of the pilots all aligning to produce a survivable scenario against overwhelming odds. In 1985, several surviving crew members reunited in Austin, Texas. Age had silvered their hair and slowed their pace, but when they stood before a B-17 on static display, the years seemed to vanish. They walked through the aircraft, each recalling their position on that day 42 years prior. Bragg, then 67, sat once more in the pilot's seat, his hands instinctively finding the control yoke. "She was a fine ship," he said quietly. "She brought us home when she had every reason to fail. You can't ask more than that from an airplane." Burbridge, standing in the bombardier's station in the nose, gestured through the plexiglass. "That's where I saw the fighter coming straight at us. I can still picture his face just before James took him down." They signed autographs for aviation enthusiasts who had come to meet the men of All-American 3, answered questions, posed for photographs, and shared memories. But there were also long silences, moments when each man was back over Tunisia, feeling the aircraft shudder from impact, wondering if the next second would be their last. Military historians place All-American 3's incident within the broader context of the air campaign over Europe and North Africa. The story exemplifies both the resilience of American bomber engineering and the bravery of the young men who flew them. It demonstrates that survival in aerial combat often relied on a combination of solid engineering, skilled piloting, and sheer luck. The event also influenced post-war aircraft design. The principle of redundancy, constructing aircraft able to endure battle damage, became central to military aviation. Modern combat aircraft incorporate lessons from B-17 experience, including multiple hydraulic systems, backup flight controls, and structural reinforcements that prevent catastrophic failure from localized damage. The statistics of All-American 3's survival remain astonishing. 90 minutes of flight from collision to landing, 150 miles flown with catastrophic structural damage, 20,000 feet altitude at impact, 10 crew members all surviving uninjured, the tail section barely attached by a few metal strips, 6 weeks to repair and return to service, and a single photograph that captured the impossible. Serial number 41 to 24,406, a number that should have appeared on a loss report, testifies to a survival that defied probability, yet was meticulously documented and confirmed. Today, only a handful of B-17s remain airworthy, maintained by dedicated groups preserving the legacy of the Flying Fortress. At airshows, veterans and enthusiasts gather to hear the distinctive roar of the Wright Cyclone engines and to remember. The story of All-American 3 is recounted, usually by someone connected to the crew or who has studied the incident in depth. Young audiences may initially doubt its truth. Then they see the photographs, read the testimonies, examine the technical reports. Skepticism gives way to astonishment. The aircraft itself was scrapped in 1945 after giving all she had. Yet her story endures in museums, books, and the memories of the dwindling number of World War II veterans. She has become more than an airplane, she embodies American industrial ingenuity, aircrew courage, and the sometimes inexplicable nature of survival in combat. In his final interview before passing in 2013, Bombardier Ralph Burbridge was asked what message he wished to convey about All-American 3. He paused before answering, "We were just doing our job." That's the essence of the story. They weren't heroes, they were young men far from home fulfilling a necessary duty. The plane was built by people doing theirs, creating the best bomber they could. When we were struck, everyone executed their roles. Kenny flew. The gunners watched for fighters. I navigated. Sam climbed out of the tail. The miracle wasn't that we survived, the miracle was that thousands of people, from factory workers to ground crews, all performed their duties so that when disaster struck, we had a chance. That's the American way, everyone contributing. And sometimes, when it's needed most, it all comes together. They flew home in an aircraft that shouldn't have flown, landed a plane that shouldn't have landed, and survived what should have been their end. If that isn't miraculous, what is? The story of All-American 3 transcends a simple combat tale. It marks a moment when the impossible became achievable, where engineering excellence met human resolve and produced a result that still challenges understanding of what aircraft can endure. The 10 men who flew on February 1, 1943 were sustained not merely by 4 Wright Cyclone engines and aluminum, but by the collective skill of American industry, rigorous training, and perhaps a touch of fate. Their survival proved that the B-17 Flying Fortress earned its reputation not through propaganda, but by demonstrated capability. For the Germans who witnessed it, this event was a glimpse of the challenge they truly faced: not only American aircraft, but American industrial strength, training, and determination. For a Luftwaffe struggling with attrition, All-American 3 proved the numbers would never be in their favor. The photograph of that day, showing the B-17 flying with a nearly severed tail, has become iconic. Yet it symbolizes more than one miraculous escape. It embodies the essence of the American air campaign: damaged but still flying, wounded but continuing to fight, yet returning home. Kendrick Bragg and his crew did not intend to make history, they intended to complete a mission. When disaster struck and a German fighter ripped their aircraft nearly in half, they responded with quiet professionalism, performing their duties calmly and effectively. Each man at his station, trusting in the aircraft, their training, and one another, produced a story that would endure, a testament to what is possible when engineering mastery meets human courage. The Germans were astonished to see 2 aircraft entwined in what should have been mutual destruction, and yet the American bomber survived. It foreshadowed the industrial and military might that would eventually overwhelm the Third Reich. All-American 3 flew home on February 1, 1943, carrying 10 men who should have perished, in a plane that shouldn't have flown but did, symbolizing that American bombers, crews, and sometimes sheer luck could overcome impossible odds. The tail section that eventually fell after landing, unable to support even 3 curious ground crew members, had held itself aloft for 90 minutes, a lasting aviation mystery demonstrating that courage, ingenuity, and determination can sometimes defy physics. Engineers, historians, and veterans alike agree, this shouldn't have been possible. Yet the records, photographs, and testimonies all confirm that All-American 3 returned when she should have crashed. In that improbability lies the story's heart: in extreme conditions, ordinary people can achieve extraordinary feats. 10 young Americans in a shattered bomber refused to accept defeat. In that refusal, against impossible odds, they forged a legend that will endure as long as the Second World War is remembered. The Germans witnessed 2 B-17s survive a seemingly fatal collision, one dying, one damaged, yet determined, and saw the pinnacle of American engineering, skill, and resilience. They saw the impossible.